This is a passage taken from a practice test for SAT from the reading comprehension portion. And I recommend that you pause the video, take a few seconds to look it over, just to get familiar with the passage. Okay, so the first sentence just clues you in on a little fact that the passage below was written about 60 years ago. And so after you start reading the passage, it might become clear how this is relevant. But jumping into the body of the passage. The pioneers of the teaching of science imagined that its introduction into education would remove the conventionality, artificiality, and backward-lookingness which were characteristic of classical studies. But they were gravely disappointed. Okay, so the first thing to note is that this first sentence is really not the easiest of sentences to understand. They do this often, I think, in the reading comprehension passages, just to sort of really throw you off in the first sentence. And what it tempts you to do is just to skip through it and go into the rest of the paragraph, trying to piece it together as you go along. But I would caution against doing that, because usually the first sentence, probably first 2 or 3 sentences, I'd say, are very important, and so it's important that you take the time to really parse it carefully so that you understand the meaning. The pioneers of the teaching of science imagined. Okay, so who's doing the imagining? It's the pioneers. And what are they pioneers of? They are pioneers of the teaching of science. Okay, note, it's very important to see that it's not pioneers of science, but pioneers of the teaching of science, and that's going to be important later on. Because the pioneers imagined what? They imagined that its introduction into education, okay, and then the its being the teaching of science, okay? So introducing the teaching of science into education would do what? It would remove 3 things: the conventionality, artificiality, and backward-lookingness. Now, the first thing you should think when you see these 3 words is, what is the common theme here? The theme is that, yes, you guessed it, okay, these are very negative words. Artificiality, like who wants to be told they're artificial, okay, conventional. Backward-lookingness, it almost sounds like they're going out of their way to emphasize how negative this is. Okay, and these 3 features are all what? They're all characteristics of classical studies. Classical studies being, the study of ancient Greek, ancient Latin, okay? So removing these 3 negative things basically amounts to what? It amounts to a positive thing, right? Because if you're removing bad things, then you're basically doing a good thing. And so this whole sentence, what it says is, these pioneers imagined that introducing the teaching of science would basically be good for education. Because why? Because it would remove some bad things that were characteristics of what they had been doing before. So the classical studies here really contrasts with science. But they were gravely disappointed. Okay, so the meaning of this is pretty clear now, is that the pioneers, those pioneers, they had wanted to do a good thing by introducing science teaching, but in the end they were disappointed. And so by this point, if you had analyzed this carefully, the question that should be left in your head is, why? Why were they disappointed? Okay, and we would expect that later on in this paragraph or in the rest of the passage, the author will be addressing why the pioneers were disappointed. And so that is actually a very key thing to do, is to always anticipate where the rest of this passage is going to be going. Okay, so to continue, so too in their time had the humanists thought. Okay, this so too is actually a very important clue that tells you this next sentence is going to have a very similar idea structure to the first sentence. Okay, so too in their time had the humanists thought. The humanists thought compares very analogously to the pioneers imagined. Okay, so the humanists thought what? They thought that the study of the classical authors in the original would banish at once the dull pedantry and superstition of medieval scholasticism. Okay, so here we have another clue. It's to banish the dull pedantry and superstition. So again, you see that pedantry is a word that usually has very negative connotations, right? It's a teacher who just sort of dwells on sort of very pedantic things. Okay, so but by banishing these negative things, then again, we're doing something that's very positive, something very good. Okay, so now you can see how these two sentences, the first two sentences, are similar in that the pioneers thought they were doing a good thing by removing the bad characteristics of the old classical studies. And then, in their time, which is, it sounds like it's even before that, the humanists had thought the same thing. Okay, they thought that studying the classical authors would be doing a good thing by moving away from medieval superstition. Okay, so finally, the professional schoolmaster was a match for both of them, and has almost managed to make the understanding of chemical reactions as dull and as dogmatic an affair as the reading of Virgil's Aeneid. Okay, what does this mean? The professional schoolmaster was a match for both of them. This sounds like the schoolmaster was sort of in a contest or a competition with the pioneers and the humanists, and it turns out that the schoolmaster was actually more effective than either of them. He beat them. And what was he beating them at? He actually managed to make both science, which is chemical reactions, and classical studies, which is reading Virgil's Aeneid, very dull and very dogmatic. And so this is a very sarcastic tone, right? Because you remember the pioneers, they had the best of intentions because they wanted to, make education more interesting by teaching science, but they failed. And the humanists, they wanted to make classical studies, more interesting and not as superstitious. And the implication is that they also didn't do a very good job, because in the end, the professional teacher, okay, he actually defeated both of them. Okay, he laid rest to their best intentions by making both of them very dull and very dogmatic. So again, this dull and dogmatic are very negative words. And so this is, overall, it's just a very sarcastic tone that the author is taking. Okay, so I think it's actually pretty important to always come away with a good sense of what is the author's attitude. Okay, so in this case, he's being very negative. So then later on in the passage, we're probably going to expect to see the author address why he has these negative opinions. For example, how has the teaching of science failed to accomplish its goals? And also, why is the professional teacher doing such a bad job? Okay, making everything so boring. And then finally, he's probably going to be also giving some suggestions of how things can be improved.